Um, Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Friends of the Cabildo lecture series. I hope everybody's having a good Tuesday. And just quick couple of updates before we get started. Next week we have Dr. Nancy Dixon and Dr. Leslie Petty doing Voices and Visions essays on New Orleans literary history. So I hope you take advantage of that. As always, this is a free benefit to the Friends of the Cabildo members. And also remember, if you're a member, you get Museum Month. And so you can go to, I heard 31 earlier this week, but I think it's 29 museums in the city with your Friends of the Cabildo membership, plus a guest. So take advantage of that. A lot of great ones on there, and you can look up Museum Month and you can get the whole list. So tonight we're going to be talking about Creole history, and then we talk about Creole history and the race and the education in it. And when I was sent this this book, Dr. Hendry is from LSU and is a retired emeritus from LSU. And I saw this name of this book and I was like, oh, this is such an unbelievable large amount of time period. This has got to be very interesting because there's got to be a lot of work and research done on it. So I hope you guys enjoy the talk tonight. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Pietra Hendry of LSU, and she's going to be talking about her new book, and I'm going to link it in the chat here. And welcome. We're very excited to have you tonight.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for joining us this evening. It's an honor to be here. And thanks again to Jason for organizing this and for inviting me. As Jason just pointed out, this talk is taken from my most recent book, Reimagining the Educated Citizen, Creole Pedagogies in the Transatlantic World, 1685 to 1896. So Louisiana, as we know, is well known for Bourbon Street, jazz, Cajun cooking, and LSU football. We are not known for being a leader in public education. Just the opposite. We're always ranked 48th or 49th in the nation for education. This evening, though, I want to tell another story of a time when Louisiana was a trailblazer for public education. After the Civil War, as Southern states rejoined the Union, Louisiana was at the forefront of demanding social equality, and this included integrated public education. Carolyn Bell writes, Louisiana's Constitutional Convention of 1867 was arguably the Reconstruction South's most radical blueprint for change. Unlike other state constitutions, it went to unprecedented lengths to achieve complete equality for Black Louisianans. It alone, among Reconstruction constitutions, explicitly required equal treatment on public transportation, in businesses, and other places of public accommodation, and it forbade segregation in the public schools. The school integration and public accommodations provisions of the Louisiana Constitution were a century ahead of their time. In fact, public education in Louisiana has had a very long history that preceded the 1867 Constitution. But what I wondered was what made this possible? What made this radical constitution that forbade segregation possible, and why isn't this common knowledge? In part, it's our unique French colonial history that differed significantly from British colonial history in both understandings of race. In the case of the French, the understandings of race were fluid and much more Creole. And of course, the French were Catholic, whereas the British were Protestant. The transatlantic circuit that emerged as a result of French colonialism, indigenous trade, and the enslavement of Africans resulted in what I call a creolization or mixing of cultures that was multilingual, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and transnational. And it's in this transatlantic circuit that was born what I call an Afro Afro-Franco-Creole protest tradition, whose vision of social equality saw public education as central to a shared humanity. So I'm going to share 3 stories from my book that highlight this Afro-Franco-Creole protest tradition, and then hopefully we're going to have some time for questions and conversation. So my first story is about Marie Turpin. After several weeks traveling down the Mississippi from Kaskaskia, just south of present-day St. Louis, you can see it on the map below St. Louis, in the upper Louisiana territory in the latter part of 1747, Marie Turpin, age 18, born of a French father and an Illinois Catholic convert mother, arrived in New Orleans, where she entered the Ursuline convent school as a fee-paying boarding student with a desire to become a professed nun. And you can see here, this is not the convent that currently is in the Ursuline convent that's in New Orleans now. This was the first permanent, the one that preceded the convent that is in New Orleans now. And it deteriorated very quickly after it was built in 1734. And so they had to build another convent, which is the one that sits in New Orleans now. So the Ursuline nuns, of course, arrived as missionaries in New Orleans from France in 1727, with the express purpose of educating and converting indigenous women and girls as part of their vision of spiritual universalism. Marie was not the only student born of a French indigenous marriage at the convent. Her niece, Marianne Chauvin, the daughter of one of Louisiana's founding French families, and his wife, also an Illinois convert, also went to the Ursuline school. Their presence at the convent signified the Ursulines' commitment to educate all girls and women, regardless of race, class, or ethnicity. Marie, a devout Catholic, French speaker, and already literate, was older than most of the boarding students who had entered at a much earlier age. Her French father, Louis, recently widowed, was deeply devoted to his daughter and had been reluctant to have her leave home. So given that she had never experienced convent life or the big city, he encouraged her to first become a student before making her profession, hopeful that she would perhaps change her mind and return to Kaskaskia. However, in July of 1749, after 14 months as a student, Marie formally requested that she be allowed to begin her novitiate. She was not deterred by the fact that she would not have the full rank of a choir nun, but instead would be a converse or domestic nun, carrying out the duties of cooking, nursing, or sewing. While her wealth and education did not exclude her from becoming a full nun, it was most likely her social status, i.e., her class, as the daughter of a royal storekeeper, that restricted her access to becoming a full choir nun. Marie took her final vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty in 1751, becoming Sister Saint Martha, and served as a nun until her death in 1761. As the first Creole nun, meaning that she was born in colonial New France, not France itself, her story exemplifies not only the early history of education in Louisiana, but the complex processes of creolization that shaped her decision to leave her home in Kaskaskia and to become an Ursuline nun. And I want to talk about that process of creolization just a little. Marie Turpin was born in 1729 in Kaskaskia in what is now the state of Illinois. And when she was born, she entered a rapidly changing and complex world. The upper Mississippi Valley at this time was dominated by the Illini-Wit Confederation. For over 100 years, the 12 to 13 tribes of the Confederacy had garnered power by controlling the middle ground that linked the Great Lakes, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Great Plains. Illinois had prospered, building a strong and complex network of cities and trade. Growing up in Kaskaskia, Marie was part of a multicultural, multilingual community that reflected an increasingly hybrid Creole world. By the time she was born, the Jesuits had already lived among the Illini for 30 years, learning their language, studying their culture, and hoping for the conversion of Illinois souls. The Jesuits had arrived among the Illinois in the 1670s and had developed developed a mission of the Immaculate Conception. And you can see the church in the middle of the village, picture here of Kaskaskia. And of course, this church and the school that was part of that church was part of their vision of developing a universal global church, uniting all people in a common humanity. Being raised a Catholic, Marie attended daily mass at the Immaculate Conception Church, just steps from her home, a 3-story stone house with a galley, stone chimneys, and shingled roof. Walking to church, she joined not only other Illinois, as well as French settlers, but also the enslaved Africans who were forced to work on the Jesuit plantation and participate in catechism classes. Hers was a Creole, cosmopolitan world in which indigenous, French, and African cultural exchanges shaped everyday life and processes of creolization. And this is a 1735 drawing by Alexander de Potts, which really reflects this creolization. You have members of three different indigenous tribes, the Attakapas, the Illini, and I believe, I'm forgetting which this one was, but then you also have the young African boy who is not enslaved. He could be part of a maroon family, but also dressed in a cross between, it looks like African European dressing. And then you have the European goods that are on the shore here. So this sort of, captures these processes of creolization that are going on and that that were a part of Marie's daily life. So while the Illinois entertained Catholicism, they resisted learning French. So Marie sang hymns and heard sermons that were translated by the Jesuits into her native Anishinaabe language. Her education was entrusted to Father Boulanger, one of the many Jesuits who established mission schools as part of a vast network of missions and schools in the Mississippi Valley from Canada to New Orleans. While these schools were designed to indoctrinate indigenous and enslaved peoples into Catholicism, it also allowed them to gain access to literacy and to appropriate Catholicism for their own purposes. For the missionaries, Marie becoming a nun represented the apex of their missionary goals. Yet for Marie, a mixed French indigenous woman, her education and decision to become a nun allowed her to traverse a complex hybrid world as an active agent in shaping her own destiny as the first Creole mixed race nun at the Ursuline Convent. And today, of course, the Ursuline Academy on State Street in New Orleans is the oldest continuous education for women in the United States. My second story that I want to share is about Marie Couvent. Marie Couvent was born about 1757 in West Africa, and it's the gold yellowish line on the map that represents her journey. She was captured by slave traders as a child in the 1760s. Torn from her parents, family, and village, she survived the brutal Middle Passage and arrived in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. Whether she worked as an enslaved domestic or on one of the large sugar plantations, forced to do the backbreaking work of harvesting sugar in the fields, she survived into adulthood. At the age of 44 in 1801, she escaped to New Orleans during the tumultuous Haitian Revolution, the largest successful slave rebellion in history. Arriving in New Orleans, among the waves of thousands of refugees to the United States, she came not as a slave, but at some point she had managed, either through manumission or purchasing her freedom, to become a free person of color. It is likely that Marie settled in the French Quarter and worked peddling textile goods at the French market near the river. And this is another example of this creolization that's taking place, because in the market here on the left, you have African-American women. On the right, you have indigenous, probably Choctaw women selling their filet. And then you can see that there are lots of other ethnicities represented here at the French market. Like many other Haitian refugees, she purchased property in the rapidly growing city in both the French Quarter on Barrack Street, close to the Ursuline Convent, which had now, of course, was built, And in the newly developing Faubourg Maronay at the corner of Grand Home and Union, today it's Dauphine and Thoreau. Living on Barrack Street, she walked past the Ursuline convent every day on her way to the market. Most likely, she heard the laughter of the children in the convent yard during their play sessions and saw the enslaved African children enter the cloistered convent for their afternoon catechism classes. As a devout Catholic, she would have attended daily mass at the convent chapel, an interracial public space where white and black worshiped together alongside each other and participated in communion, catechism classes, baptisms, and marriages. In 1812, her earnings allowed her to purchase 5 enslaved Africans. One of these, Bernard Couvent, a carpenter and enslaved of the Ursulines, she freed, and in 1812, they married. And this is their marriage certificate. And neither one of them could write, but you can see the X's at the bottom that signify their signature. She also owned at least 23 enslaved Africans during her lifetime. She emancipated 3 of these enslaved women, but owned 5 other slaves at the time of her death. Over the course of the next 20 years, Marie and Bernard were part of a growing network of free people of color who were deeply invested in building a strong Afro-Catholic Creole community through developing networks in the Catholic Church, Masonic lodges, and business enterprises. While Marie could not sign her name, it would have been clear to her that education, along with legal status, property ownership, and marital status were significant markers for free people of color in securing their independence and maintaining it, which was paramount to retaining, their status, given the increasing racial restrictions that they faced in antebellum New Orleans. It would not have gone unnoticed by Marie, who lived a stone's throw from an Ursuline convent, that schools were springing up almost on every street corner during the decades of the 1820s and 30s. However, there were few, if any, options for destitute children of color, those who were orphaned because of yellow fever or cholera epidemics, or who lost their parents to, other families being enslaved. And in 1832, suffering from fever, she wrote her will, which bequeathed to the Catholic Church the money necessary to provide a free school, thus public, free school for orphans of the Faubourg Maronay. And of course, the Catholic Church served as a protective umbrella that could support the Afro-Creole community and provide protection for them and the school in case they came under fire from, the city council or governor, etc. Although she could not sign her name, she dictated in her will, "My name is Marie Justine Sinaire. I was born in Guinea. When I was perhaps 7 years of age, I was carried to Saint-Domingue. I'm as a result not aware of the name of my father nor of my mother, nor do I know my age. I was married to Bernard Couvent, free Negro, whose widow I now am. We have no children. I bequeath and order that my land at the corner of Grand Home and Union Streets be dedicated and used in perpetuity for the establishment of a free school for the colored orphans of the Faubourg Maronay. Also, I declare that said lands and buildings shall never be sold under any pretext whatsoever." Marie did die a few years later on June 29, 1837, at the approximate age of 80. Her funeral was held at St. Louis Cathedral. After her death, a group of prominent free men of color created la Institution catholique pour l'instruction des orphelins dans l'indigence, so the Catholic Institute for Indigent Orphans, and it's better known as the Couvent School or the Catholic Institute. It opened in 1848, fulfilling the wishes of her will. At this time, public schools, which had been supposedly public schools, which had been established in 1841 in New Orleans, were for whites only. So I don't consider these public schools because they were for whites only. Not everyone could attend. This made it imperative for Afro-Creoles to establish their own schools. By 1850, 300 children of color attended the school. The teachers at the school, many prominent Afro-Creole intellectuals, including Armand Louis, Paul Trevin, and writers, Camille Terry, emphasized education as a tool to challenge racial prejudice and combat inequality. The Catholic Institute was the cornerstone of the Afro-Creole civil rights work, in which they hoped to achieve the unfulfilled revolutionary ideals of American democracy. Known as the Nursery for Revolution, they developed a radical agenda aimed at attaining civil and political rights for people of color in the Americas. During the next century, 4 distinct schools existed at this location. The 4th incarnation, Bishop Perry Middle School, closed following Hurricane Katrina. Today, the St. Gerard Mahalia Alternative School for pregnant girls operates on Couvant's property. So the wishes of her will have been fulfilled. That property has never been sold, and there has always been a school on it. Over 150 years old. This is the oldest continuously operating Catholic educational institution for African Americans in the South. Marie's agency in starting a school, while complex, has continually served as a space for the education of thousands of African American children. Her story demands that we reimagine not only the long, rich history of African American education, but the very origins of public education in Louisiana. So my last story is about Jean-Baptiste Bazenac. On a muggy morning in June of 1809, Jean-Baptiste Bazenac traveled a short distance around the corner to begin his new position as schoolmaster, as well as music teacher in his recently opened school in the French Quarter. He was not sure how many students would be in attendance, given that he had only placed an advertisement in the Courier a few days earlier. His decision to offer his services as a teacher were not of his own making. Arriving just 2 months earlier from Cuba in May of 1809, Jean Bazenac, a free man of color, was one of about 9,059 refugees originally from the French colony of Saint-Domingue, of whom 3,102 were free people of color, 2,731 were white, and 3,226 had been enslaved. And you can see here in the graph by 1810 that this influx of Haitian refugees doubled the population of New Orleans, the total there in the last column, as well as making free people of color and slaves about 2/3 of the population of New Orleans. Jean had not fled Saint-Domingue in 1791 at the start of the Haitian Revolution, when the enslaved in the Northern Plain revolted. Most likely he left to escape the warfare that was engulfing the countryside in 1802, when Napoleon sent his army to recapture Haiti, overthrow the Black general Toussaint Louverture, and reinstate slavery. The fear of losing his freedom due to recolonization by France sent Jean and his family to Santiago, Cuba, a Spanish colony where free men of color had most rights afforded to all Spanish colonists, including citizenship. So he was a full citizen there with all the rights that entailed. Most likely arriving in Cuba in 1803, Jean could not have anticipated that his family would once again be uprooted in 1809 when Napoleon invaded Spain. And fear of French aggression in Cuba resulted in the Spanish colonial officials there ejecting all French citizens. So, having lost his fortune twice, once in Haiti and then in Cuba, Jean was fortunate to be a skilled professional whose educational talents were increasingly in high demand in the recently formed United States Louisiana Territory. The influx of Haitian refugees into New Orleans, as I mentioned, had doubled the population of the city, resulting in 29% of the population being made up of free people of color, and enslaved Africans making up 34% of the total population. Jean and his family were just one of hundreds of refugee families who sought housing, jobs, and schools for their children. Many refugee families, both white and free people of color, settled on Bourbon and other French Quarter streets, which were home to a predominantly Creole, Francophone, Catholic population. Given the fears that revolutionary ideas of Black equality would be spread by Haitian refugees, racial tensions in New Orleans were definitely heightened. New Orleans slaveholders were anxious that revolts among the enslaved, like the one that had taken place in 1795 in Point Capee, were being fomented, especially in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution. And indeed, by 1811, the largest rebellion of enslaved Africans in the United States would take place along the German coast. Louisiana was at the crossroads of a revolutionary, Atlantic revolutionary activity where Haitian revolutionaries, Mexican insurgents, French emigres, runaway enslaved, and maroon Africans aspired to advance the causes of freedom and racial equality. And while it was not illegal to teach the enslaved to read and write at this time in 1809 and 1810, that was not forbidden until the 1830s in Louisiana. So it's not illegal to teach them to read and write at this point. The increased tensions gave Bosanek pause as to whether he should offer classes to enslaved Africans in his evening classes. However, given the revolutionary fervor of the time, Bosanek was hopeful that the abolition of slavery and the granting of citizenship to all men was on the horizon. And this is what had been promised in the when Napoleon ceded Louisiana to the Americans, that they would receive the full rights of citizenship. However, given the revolutionary fervor of the time, Bosanek, again, was hopeful that the abolition of slavery and the granting of citizenship to all men was on the horizon. And this, of course, made it imperative to prepare all, including the enslaved Africans, for freedom. And so he did offer night classes for enslaved Africans for a time. Among refugees from Haiti, Jean was not alone in his quest to establish himself as an educator. He, like many of the other white and free people of color, a refugee of his generation, both male and female, had taken for granted the right to education. The concept of racially integrated education was not unknown to the Haitian refugees, nor was the idea of public education. A central issue that had been taken up by the French National Assembly after they had granted political rights to free people of color in Haiti in May of 1791 was the need for public education. By May of 1794, a public Republican school had been established in Le Cap for students of all colors, an integrated public school. By 1801, Louverture's Constitution for Haiti included plans for establishing a national system of public schools. So clearly, Jean Bosanek, as well as other refugees, had experienced a national public education system. No doubt this shaped their efforts to promote and create a system of public education that they saw lacking upon their arrival in New Orleans in 1810. Schools established by the Haitian teachers, both white and free people of color, understood the vital role of public education in a Republican democratic government. In 1811, at least 25% of the teachers listed in the city directory of New Orleans were refugees from Haiti. Let me just say that again. 25% of the teachers in 1811 were refugees from Haiti. This included 6 white males, the blue dots, dark blue dots, 1 white woman, and 2 who were identified as free men of color, including Jean Baptiste. At least 17% of all the teachers in New Orleans were free people of color. And at least 27% of women and at least 27% were women, diversity that was unprecedented in other American cities of the time, where teachers were predominantly white and male. And at the time when the refugees arrived, New Orleans already had at least 3 schools and 3 teachers who were identified as free men of color. These men were not recent immigrants, but they came from a mixed lineage of French, Spanish, and African families. While some refugees engaged in education only briefly until they could find more lucrative employment, many were committed educators who saw education as critical to creating an interracial, democratic public sphere through which human equality would be embodied. This commitment is exemplified by Jean Bazinec's school, which welcomed students of all colors. Bazinec's son, Joseph, would also become a teacher, and in the 1840s co-direct a renowned interracial school in the Faubourg Marigny with the white French exile Jean-Louis Marquette, who in 1843 helped launch the Afro-Creole Album Littéraire, a radical journal critiquing the rampant injustices of Louisiana racism. Joseph would eventually teach at the Catholic Institute, which we just talked about. It was right across from the school that he had run with Jean-Louis Marquette. And that school closed and he went to go teach at the Couvent School. So these fugitive stories of Jean and his son Joseph are part of a much larger Afro-Creole protest tradition grounded in public rights, which highlights the transatlantic activism that reflects what I call a Creole pedagogical circuit that shaped New Orleans' educational history. Within these hybrid Creole crossroads, previously unimagined spaces of educational and political activism emerge that challenge the grand narrative of American public education. So, in conclusion, dominant histories of public education in Louisiana maintain that it was not established until the introduction of Horace Mann's Common School movement in the 1840s. And of course, he was from Boston, Massachusetts, and his model of schooling was brought here in the 1840s under the guise of being public. However, the presence of let me just point out though, again, the public schools or state-funded schools, which are the purple ones, were white only. So in my mind, I cannot actually call them public schools. So I call them state-funded schools. They're getting money from the legislature, but they are only for whites. But simultaneously, in 1842, you have non-state funded schools, which are either paying tuition or groups are raising money or the schools are free. And these are schools that are where free people of color and possibly enslaved have access. And you can see there are 17 schools at this time that I was able to locate. And I'm sure there are other, smaller private schools as well. And the majority of these, at least the first 10, all are taught by free men of color, many of them Haitian refugees. So again, the point that I am making is that prior to these supposed public schools, which were really white or white only, I think we have to take into account the presence of Marie Turpin, a mixed race nun at the Ursuline convent, which allowed all students, regardless of race or class, to attend. And we have to look at the founding of the Catholic Institute by the ex-slave Marie Couvent, which again was a free school for Black children, and the interracial school of Jean Bazinec and his son, Joseph. All of these, and there's many more stories in the book, attest to a long history of public education in Louisiana that preceded the supposed common school movement of public schools. So the stories that I provide, I think, challenge the dominant narratives of educational history by situating Louisiana as part of a vibrant, dynamic, revolutionary Creole pedagogical circuit that challenged emerging constructs of race, democracy, and education. Ironically, these experiments in interracial democratic education came to an end in 1841 with the introduction of the Common School movement, in which public schools were established as white only, marking the public sphere as a segregated space and constructing African Americans as non-citizens. Louisiana's educational history contests not only the story of the Common School movement as the origins of public education, but it situates Louisiana as part of the transatlantic world that produced counter-Enlightenment ideologies of citizenship, not bounded by nation, race, or the law, but in a philosophy of equal rights that is produced in public spaces, especially schools. And so these are just a few of the stories that are told in my book. Again, the book begins in 1685 with the Code Noir, in which the enslaved were guaranteed a right to Catholic education. The Catholic Church, of course, was the most public institution in French colonial America. And again, they were forced, everyone had to be Catholic. But the advantage of this was that you were exposed to an education, to literacy, and to the cultural capital of the Catholic Church. But the notion of rights and public rights, and the Catholic Church was a public space in New Orleans and throughout the French colonial empire. Again, as I pointed out, Black and white worshiped together, took communion. Everyone had the right of marriage, of baptism. So this was a public right. So, and although enslaved people were not seen as equals in the social sphere, they were seen as equals in the spiritual and in the moral sphere, and they were entitled to these rights of the church. So this notion of public rights, of course, the notion of public rights ends with Plessy versus Ferguson, the final nail in the coffin, in 1896, with the end of public rights and racial segregation being imposed on every aspect of American life. And so I see this as the end of public rights as the foundation for democratic education. And what we move to instead then, of course, at the turn of the century, is the notion of civil rights and the law as undergirding the right to a public education. So Chapter 1 of the book describes, again, the educational encounters between the indigenous peoples and Jesuit and Ursuline missionaries in New France as part of their effort to create a universal global system of education. The chapter looks at 4 transatlantic spaces: early Jesuit missionary activity in Canada, the missionary work of Marie of the Incarnation, who founded the first North American Ursuline convent in Quebec in 1639, so almost 100 years prior to the Ursulines in New Orleans. Thirdly, it looks at the Illinois Jesuit mission in Kaskaskia, because that was the first Jesuit plantation that engaged enslaved Africans. And of course, that is a very complex and disturbing history and contradictory history, but it is one that we need to grapple with. And the fourth part of that chapter is looking at the missionary work of Father Paul Deroux, the first Jesuit missionary in Louisiana in 1700. Chapter 2 focuses on the Ursuline French teaching order in New Orleans, which again had the mission of educating girls of all races, classes, and ethnicities. Of course, they did not get the same curriculum, but they were all within the spaces of the convent. And this was, of course, part of the Ursuline project of converting all girls to Catholicism, since mothers were the best teachers, and part of their vision of spiritual universalism and educational universalism. Of course, for the enslaved Africans and indigenous people who were forced to live in the convent, the stories I tell about them are the ways in which they appropriated, adapted, and resisted these pedagogical spaces. All right. Not only to leverage as many rights and freedoms as they could, but also to reestablish and maintain their own African and indigenous cultural systems. And I can talk about that a little bit if someone's interested. So however flawed or limited the Ursuline vision might have been, it contributed to establishing an Afro-Creole Catholic protest tradition that appropriated the Catholic doctrine of universal educational rights to assert a common universal humanity. Chapter 3 focuses on how the reverberations of the Haitian Revolution and its promise of racial equality sent shockwaves through the United States, contributing to the production of the white citizen embodied in the Common School movement. The chapter chronicled the attempts to establish interracial public education in New Orleans prior to the 1840s Common School movement. And in addition to the smaller schools like the one that Bozenac founded, it also examines the College d'Orléans, which was founded in 1811, and many Haitian refugees participated there as teachers, as well as the integrated St. Claude School for Colored and White Girls, which was founded in 1824. And it was the oldest elementary, it is the oldest elementary Catholic school for African American people in the United States. And I also discuss in this chapter the founding of the Sisters of the Holy Family, the second order of African American women religious, and of course their initial school, which was the Bayou Road School, but of course that developed into a network of schools throughout the state of Louisiana during segregation, as well as internationally in Belize and in Nigeria. Chapter 4 highlights how a Creole pedagogy of imagination was engaged by Afro-Creoles and other disenfranchised groups in counter-public spaces. If you don't have schools, there are other places in which to promote education, including Masonic lodges, literary associations, and benevolent societies. And these were used to envision freedom in the increasingly repressive years leading up to the Civil War. These counter-public spaces in the 40s and 50s contested the racialization of education and were developed in response to the ideologies of white supremacy that were increasingly fueled by constructs of scientific racism. Specifically, the chapter examines the Catholic Institute, which we talked about. It also, though, looks at the Perseverance Lodge number 4, which was an interracial Masonic lodge, and the Turnvereins, which were the German educational societies. And each of these, I argue, functioned as a counter-public space that fostered political activities that allowed the disenfranchised, those who could not be participate as citizens. It allowed them to claim their political subjectivity and see themselves as political agents despite their racial and ethnic subordination. So, chapter 5, the last chapter, looks at an interracial coalition of radical activists that in 1861 started the New Orleans Tribune, the first African-American daily newspaper in the United States, which was bilingual, and the Crusader, the mouthpiece of the Citizens Committee that organized the legal challenge to racial segregation, resulting in the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. For both newspapers, they advocated that segregation, especially in public schools, would always be a mark of inferiority and would create a caste system that was antithetical to the public rights they saw as critical to the equality promised by American democracy. So in this regard, they were ahead of the Brown versus Board education ruling by at least 75 years. So not 75, close to 75. So my book ends with Plessy versus Ferguson, and thank you again for joining me tonight, and I'll open it up for questions.
Fantastic. All right. got a couple questions here. I'm going to kick off some
Okay.
questions here. The first Marie you mentioned was that Trepanier?
Yes,
And that's
Japan.
Trepan. And someone was asking the spelling of it,
It's
Trepagnier.
no, it's Turpin.
Oh, okay, there we go. All right. So the Janice says, "Wow, yeah, yeah, yeah." You know, when you say it like that, Trepanier is a very common South Louisiana name.
Oh,
So when you say it
interesting.
like that, yeah, yeah, especially Southwestern Louisiana. Um, so let me ask, talk about her first. My first question was, you mentioned that she was a nun who did more like work instead of doing it for doing it for spiritual aspects to it. I mean, or is devoted to it from a spiritual aspect because of her father's role in the French government, right?
There are two, again, the Ursulines come out of, pre-modern France, late 16th century, early 17th century. So class is what is,
Right.
of course, the
So
primary uh, factor that organizes society. So within the Ursulines, they had like two tracks of nuns, choir
okay,
nuns and um, uh, uh, oh my gosh, choir nuns and converse nuns.
gotcha.
And if you didn't have the class background but wanted to become a nun, you would become
Hmm.
a converse nun. So they could not teach. They did more of
Okay.
the domestic work. Although I would argue, and I talk about this in the book, in the 1740s and 50s, the Ursulines were so poor and so strapped and so under-resourced, they were all chopping wood. They were all doing they were all doing hard labor in many respects.
And
Um,
that's
so, but they were making a class distinction there between choir nuns who came from wealthier families and from the nobility. And she, of course, was not from the nobility. Her father worked for the colonial, for the government, colonial
that's what
government.
I was asking, was the
Yeah.
royal store. So the royal
Yes.
store are the towns.
Storekeeper.
Yeah, so
Right.
he's just, yeah, okay. He's not a merchant, he's a storekeeper.
He's a storekeeper. He's an employee of the French colonial government.
Okay.
So, I'm sure he was a very savvy trader. That's what was going on up there and was working stuff on the side because he was one of the wealthiest men in Kaskaskia. She came
Oh,
from one of
okay.
the wealthiest families there. But even though she was rich, she didn't have the class status of being nobility. So, again, one of the things I learned, we think more in terms in contemporary times, especially in the South, that race is the defining factor in society or has been historically. But in this time period, class is still, and especially for the French, and that was quite different from the British. So that's where there is some racial fluidity there, because at least in the early colonial empire, race is not as significant a marker or the way that people are defined as is class.
Yeah, and it's French culture, even though it's in the New World, and
Mhm.
obviously she had that opportunity because she could leave and go somewhere in
Yeah,
France that she could do what she wanted to do.
yeah.
So that goes to my second question, which was, now we're in New Orleans. You show the picture of the Ursuline convent. Ursuline convent
Uh-huh.
had been built by the time that the second Marie comes over, correct?
Marie Couvent, yes,
Yes. Okay.
yes,
So I mean, the Ursuline convent is an unbelievable building. It's the oldest colonial
right,
building in Mississippi River Valley for sure.
right.
It's obviously one of the oldest convents in the United States, but I mean, it's such a remarkable building. How were they able to have the money to build that?
Well, great question. That the convent that is the building that is in the French Quarter today
Mhm.
on Charters and Ursuline, the corner there, was built in 1754. And it was built by the French, by the monarchy, by the French government at the time. Monies were given. And it is an incredible building, and just an interesting fact. One of the differences, and it goes back to this discussion that we were having about class, the first convent, which is the one that Marie Turpin went to, which was not built very well. It was shoddy. It started deteriorating and falling apart, which is why they needed to build a more sturdy convent. But in that convent, on the third floor, were housed all of the boarding students and the orphans. So on the third floor of that convent, you had two indigenous girls, you had free girls of color, you had enslaved girls who were boarders, whose probably plantation fathers paid for them to go to school. And then you had the French girls. And then the orphans were also on the same floor. So you have all of these girls from diverse backgrounds and ethnicities all on the same floor. When they built the permanent convent, the second permanent convent, or the second one, they divided it, and the orphans were on the third floor, and all of the boarding students were on the second floor. And I think that they had gotten some criticism from the colonists, that they didn't want these girls from all these different backgrounds cavorting together on the third floor of the convent. So when they built the one that's standing there today, they did separate the orphans, who of course were considered, I shouldn't say of course, but they were unfortunately considered lower class, or not, they had no social wealth. They were on the third floor and segregated or separated from the boarding students who paid. And it was the boarding students' tuition that provided the majority of the money for the Ursulines, going back to your question of how things are financed. And of course, then they had a plantation. And originally it was not used for cash crops, it was just used to feed them, but they acquired a second plantation. And then eventually they got into the business of buying and selling slaves, and they ended up being among the top 10% of holding plantations in Louisiana by the 1780s. So as I said, it's a complex history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned this when you did talk about the change, but I just wanted to confirm this was right. I mean, do you feel that because of the way all of those girls and women were taught all together, allowed them to have access to it until the 1840s, and that basically, it was basically accepted as French culture all the way till that time, and then by that, 1830s, 1840s, you become a more Americanized, and that,
Yes.
yeah, and that whole aspect, then you're, yeah, then you're leading into,
Yeah, it's interesting, Jason, because most people, in New Orleans at least, and of course outside of New Orleans and outside of Louisiana and non-Catholic areas of the United States, people know very little about our history. And again, it's mostly stereotypes. But the Ursulines, mostly in Louisiana, are known for founding, the first school, and for bringing morality and getting order out of chaos. But they've been around for almost 300 years. And in 2027, they'll be celebrating the 300th anniversary, and they had to change and adapt. And that's in part why they became slave owners as well, because they had to make support the school There were a lot of economic perils that they had. But when the Americans came, of course, they thought that they were going to get kicked out because, the Americans were predominantly Protestant.
Right.
And they stayed. What and many of the Americans who came down sent their daughters to the Ursuline convent because it had a reputation for being a rigorous academic curriculum, and of course strict. So many Americans did send their daughters there. What happens, though, is that on the sly, they continue to board and to teach Creole girls. So it's not something that they advertise, but they do continue. You can see this by the names of the students who are registered. And when you get to the 1880s and 90s, and there's photographs of the students once they moved over to the Industrial Canal, to the third permanent convent, you can see in the pictures that there are racially mixed girls that are still going to the convent, that are still going to the school. So, but they, of course, are very much discriminated against because they're Catholic by Protestants, and the Protestants want to come in and open up their schools, and they want to have the right to take over the orphans. And so, of course, this is why the Ursulines leave the quarter in 1824 and moved to the new convent that is on what was the Industrial, Canal over there, into a beautiful, very large convent. But they leave the quarter because they're feeling the criticism and the pressure to not continue their sort of universal education. And, they were out of the way when they moved. They were on the fringes of the town in 1824 when they moved over to the where the Industrial Canal now is. That was out in the country. And so they weren't under the eye of, the governor or the mayor so much, and they could go on and do what they wanted to do.
Denise says, I recognize the picture with the nuns and the school children, the page with the quote on it. I have that picture from my dad's cousins. This was the All Saints Catholic School in Algiers, Louisiana. My dad attended this school in the 1930s.
Oh, yeah. I thought that picture is not, it is of the Couvent Institute, but it was later in the 1880s and 90s when eventually the sisters took over the school. Is that the one that she's referring to, the one where the nuns are off to the side?
We'll see if she chimes in there. I'll give her that. We'll come back to that. The 16, she said yes, yes.
Yeah. That picture right there is the Catholic Institute. It's I don't we'll have to talk about that. I thought that was the Catholic Institute in the Faubourg Maronay. So perhaps I've identified that incorrectly if you think that's in Algiers. And you can see the nuns. Eventually, the Catholic, during Reconstruction and segregation, the school becomes quite impoverished, and the Catholic Church does take it over, and an order of nuns teach there. And then it gets blown down in the hurricane, I think, of 1912. What was the big hurricane in 1912 or 1915? Somewhere around there.
Something
So,
around there.
but
Yeah.
Denise, we can email.
Yeah, go back to your last slide.
I will. I'm getting there. So you have my email. Please feel free, anyone, to email me if you have questions or comments.
Well, fantastic. Your research, we've learned a lot about the Ursuline nuns down here, but you expanded it to an even larger way of looking at it. And I really, really appreciate tonight's lecture. It was really fantastic. Someone just wrote, thank you for excellent presentation. Multiple wow. So thank you so much. It's really fantastic. I'll put a link in the chat for the book if you would like to purchase the book, and then I'll put it in the email for the people that'll be watching from home at a later time. Dr. Hendry, thank you so much. Wonderful work. September 29th, 1915 was the hurricane.
Okay, it was 15. All right, good. Thank you. That's quick.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for attending. I appreciate it. I love to share the stories that I've learned about what I consider to be a very rich history of education of Louisiana, despite what most people say. So
Well, we appreciate it so much. It was excellent talk and excellent research you've done. Good luck on the book, and thank you so much.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, everybody.